Hey everyone, and welcome to this watercolor, color pencils and gouache painting tutorial. Today we are going to paint this full composition with lots of elements. I've already transferred the sketch onto my Fabriano hot pressed watercolor paper, and I'm going to start with filling in a basic skin tone first for some areas of the painting. As you can see, I'm working again with the Komorebi watercolors, and I mixed this brownish, very light skin tone to fill out the face and some of the hair. When you start with a basic skin tone or just a very light basic tone, you don't have to only fill out the skin area. For example, you can take this tone as a undertone for the hair, or maybe even for the flowers or for the crown. What I'm doing here is carefully fill out a large area without the watercolor create some of these edges that when they dry look very strong. So I try to make an even distribution of the water, and that requires a wet brush all the time. I also try to mix in a couple of other skin tones that I find on the reference photo, while also exaggerating those. So here I'm just wetting a larger area of the motif, and then once this area is wet, I can just dip other colors into it, and while the area is wet, the color will bleed a little bit, will just distribute in this area. Here, for example, I'm just working in a little bit of brown and just a little bit more beige, so that you have not this perfectly like just one color all over the figure. Instead, we want to make a couple of variations here and there. And while I'm at it, I'm also filling in the crown. And as a base color, I'm just taking green, because it doesn't really matter what color you use as a first layer. Basically, you just have to look at your reference photo and pick the lightest color that you can find there, and then you can use that as a base color. If the thing that you paint only has a couple of white highlights, for example, you can just use gouache to add those later, and you don't need to leave those little highlights out. If you have larger white or just light areas, I suggest that you use a very, very light like base color. For example, for the face, as you can see, it is very light, so I don't use a dark base color here. Now I just continue the process by adding a couple of darker areas in the just in the shadow areas of the painting of the reference photo, or just in the areas where I find that there are darker colors. For example, the hair obviously is a darker, counts to the darker parts, and also her clothes or what she's wearing. But with this composition, or just in general with watercolor paintings, I try to not be so close to the reference photo regarding the colors. I think in order to make a very fresh and vivid watercolor painting, it is important to let a little bit loose of the reference photo regarding the colors. So I begin with very light and soft colors first. I don't want to get as dark as in the reference photo, especially not everywhere, because then the watercolor painting will get very deep and heavy, and I want it to be very light. So let's move on to the flowers. I underpaint the flowers with this greenish tone, and here again I just follow the rule that I chose the lightest color that I can find on the flowers, and then I use that as a base color and fill them in. I also like that the colors of the flowers bleed into those of the skin tones and the hair, because I want to make a pretty kind of base color where a lot of transitions are happening, where we don't have a lot of sharp edges. So later on we might leave some of these areas so that we have really an interesting layering of effects. Now I'm mixing a light blue tone for the butterfly. And here again it is important to mix a tone that is the lightest tone of the objects that we are painting. So in this case a very bright blue. Obviously, since we are working from a digital reference, we won't be able to achieve this bright of a blue tone. But that's no problem at all, because in the end we will have a very nice and soft looking watercolor painting. So for the blue tones I choose a little bit of ultramarine blue and also neon blue. So in this watercolor palette we have a neon blue color, but you don't have to do that. Just use the blue tone that is available for you and mix as much water in it as it needs to get very light. Later we can add more layers to give the butterfly more depth. Now I am using a darker color to work on the pattern of the butterfly. So as you can see, the butterfly's wings have this darker border, and for that I've mixed Payne's gray and a little bit of red to get this deep purple tone. So most of the times I avoid using straight black because I think it's just not a nice color. So I always try to get a dark color that is tinted in one or the other way. For my Photoshop mockup here, pretty much all blacks are a little bit blue or purplish. So I transferred that to the watercolor painting as well. And as you can see, I added this wet, darker like layer, and then I went into it with red again, and it immediately bleed into the dark area, so that we have this very nice transitions and effects there. It's super unimportant, in my opinion, to treat individual elements of the composition with more care than others. So in the past I would paint elements super detailed like this butterfly, for example, but then I would lose the freshness and the abstractions. So I don't do that anymore. And first, it makes the process a little bit easier because it doesn't take so long, and also every element fits better to all the other elements. So during the process you will see that I will work on all the elements pretty much simultaneously so that they fit together. Here for the butterfly I just add a little bit of the blues and darker variations of the blue to render it like the reference photo, but I don't take like super much care to make it exactly like a photorealistic depiction. Basically what is important is that the lower wing is a little bit darker than the top area of the wings, and at the edges it is kind of darker as well. So that's pretty much the first layer. And then while that dry, I continue with the flowers, because of course you could just blow dry like areas of the painting and work on them and continue working on them. But as I said, it's like easier for the final painting if you work on all the areas simultaneously, because then you get a feeling for the painting and you know when to stop, so that not one area looks more like perfect than the other one and they don't in the end fit together. So I feel it's easier if you work on everything simultaneously, but that also depends. Like for some tutorials I just finish the face first to just show you how to do it. This is a real painting that I did, so I want to show you how I do that normally, and in order to really make the best artwork that you could, or the best watercolor that you could. The next element I'm going to work on is the flowers, and here I'm very careful. So the goal is to make the flowers look very soft. We don't want them to stand out more than as any other element of the composition, and in order to paint flowers convincingly, it is important to not overdo the contrast. So each flower petal has a shadow, it has highlights, it casts a shadow on other flower petals, and all the shadows, the colors of them, are a soft variation of the base color of the flowers. So in a nutshell, they are rather difficult to paint if you want to paint them more or less convincingly. If you want to paint abstract flowers, of course, that's maybe not that difficult. So what we're going to do is, of course, having a good underdrawing here, as I do with most of my watercolors. I transferred the this is my dog snoring. I transferred the reference photo onto the paper, and then I get all the important petals. So I can use this very small brush and follow along the shadows and the midtones and the highlight areas of each petal. And I start with very light colors. So even though, for example, some like shadows are a little bit darker, I will start with the softest versions of these shadows. And I also try to use various greens and browns for that. Here I just added the pollen stems in the middle, and I also let them bleed out into the shadows, because I think that looks very nice and also very watercolory, and it doesn't have to be perfect. So I basically continue this first layer on the remaining flowers as well, just following the reference photo and have a look where I can find all the shadows. It's also important to make very sharp edges when you see them, especially like I find these edges where, for example, one petal kind of covers another one, and then there's a sharp shadow beneath the top petal, for example. And with this and for that I just use a very small brush, so that I can really make those shapes and leave lighter shapes out. It's like a mosaic where you have to just make sharp shapes of one soft shadow color, if that makes sense, and then you let it dry, and then you add another soft shadow color, maybe like cell shading, if you have heard of that. This is like digital artist works. They just add one layer of shadow and then another one. This is a little bit how I work with flowers and also with other elements when I work with watercolors. Except for faces, there I work with color pencils, as many of you know already. What you can also do when you add these cell shading like layers is, once you have put down a wet area, here you can see I add a little bit of another color of yellow, and it beautifully bleeds into like all the wet areas. So you have like this one darker wet area, and then you can also make transitions in that. So this is basically how I work on the first layers on the flowers, and you will see I will just add more layers with this technique and really closely build up to the reference photo, to just the to all the shadows, but you will see that later. So I'm just now continuing this process. if you see areas in your flowers that are very dark and that look maybe a little bit, that have a little bit more contrast than the other shades, you can use a darker shade in the beginning too. So here, for example, I added a little bit of a darker shade in the bottom flower, and now I use the same color to add more contrast on the remaining flowers as well. Here, I'm not sure if you noticed, but the thing that makes these watercolor flowers look so maybe beautiful is the transitions between those these variations of different colors. You have the green, you have the blue, the yellows. So make sure that you use lots of colors when you add this wet on wet shades, so that they have a chance to bleed into each other and make these very beautiful transitions. Also, don't rush it. Just compare your what you paint with your reference photo and try to get the right color values. And it's better to be a little bit too light than too dark, because you can't undo it. Once you have added a dark watercolor, it's rather difficult to make it light again. So here I'm just taking my time and working on the shades and trying to guess which areas I have to do a little bit darker. And now where the flowers are wet, I let them dry and continue on the face now. The flowers are not finished, obviously, but I just continue with working on the next part here, and then I will work on other elements, and then again, when they're kind of on the same stage, I will just work on other elements again. So the idea is to not finish one part, but I think you might have understand that in the beginning already, so I don't want to repeat myself too often. Yeah, so for the face, I can pretty much use the same colors that I used for the flowers, because when we start, we have anyways very light colors, and it doesn't really matter if they are a little bit more yellowish or more greenish. Skin tones have so many different colors, so everything that is in that range of earthy tones will fit. And here in the beginning, I will also apply the cell shading method that I used at the flowers. So I try to simplify the shadows that I see on the reference photo. I don't want to make gradients. The reason is, on this paper, gradients and transitions won't look good. They will have very strong edges, like the ones you can see on the butterfly. That is no problem on butterflies and flowers at all, but on skin it will look very strong and ugly, and the face should be the one element of the composition that looks rather smooth. So to do that, we will use the color pencils later on, but we also want to have some of the watercolor effects there too. So I try to make cell shading shades, like you can see there. Oh, here I'm just trying to get this spot there off, but it didn't work. Anyway, so I'm trying to make nice cell shading shapes in the face, so that I can leave them at the end of the process without having to correct them or draw over them. And in order to get nice looking shapes, you just have to look at your reference photo and determine, okay, what shape could look nice now and what shapes should I maybe not paint. And most of the times the shapes are along the cheekbones, the eyes and the nose, and I oftentimes don't paint the shapes that are directly on top of the nose, or also, for example, the rings under the eyes, or like maybe the nasolabial folds. Sometimes I don't paint them either, but you just have to check and compare and just try it out. So it's different for each reference photo. And now I will just continue this cell shading technique on the rest of the composition so that everything else is filled out approximately evenly. And here again, I'm just trying to also get in different colors, so not only gray, for example. I also use a little bit of orange, yellow, everything that I can find in her skin tone. I try to exaggerate, so whenever I find a trace of red or orange, I use a lot of, I just exaggerate this color and make it more intense and bright, because it will fade anyway once it's dried, but you will just see those beautiful transitions between the different paints. Here, for example, you have brown and green, and like having this like balance between the two the two colors is very beautiful for skin. So you will always see in the reference photos greens and oranges all the time, and when you transfer that to watercolor, it just looks very beautiful. So it's always a good thing to do that with skin tone. Yeah, and I'm just continuing that process and also fill in the remaining parts of the composition. And now I use my dripping effects technique for this watercolor painting. I do this a lot with paintings where I have just a figure on a white background, because I just want to make them stand out and just look more painterly, and this effect I think looks really nice. So I basically make a very wet area and then I just tilt my artwork. And I also, once I have this effect, I just add more color to this wet area. I like to work with a lot of metallic effects, so sometimes I add silver in it or gold, because once that is dried, you have very nice shimmer effects when you tilt the painting in the light, so I try to do that as often as possible. Here I'm adding a little bit of red and orange. I actually wanted to add red, but I didn't. I wasn't able to mix the color properly, because in my reference photo you have this play between blues and reds, and I also wanted to have that in my watercolor painting. And with those wet areas, you can play a lot with colors and let them bleed into each other, and just look how that works out. And I wanted to add one of these stripes, like another one, and yeah, you can just control it a little bit with adding water here and there. Of course, you never have the full control, but you can play a little bit around with that. There were too many white areas for my taste in the painting, so I decided to add some shadows before I continue on the other elements. You see, I already filled out a couple of areas, but there's still a lot of whites left, and on the reference photo I have a lot of shadows, so I decided to just add some of the shadows, or just the dark areas, in this case the hair. And here again I try to make nice shapes with this cell shading technique, because I never know if I will have some of them later on. So I never know if I want to leave these as a final shape. I never know that, so I try to make every shape as nice as possible. And for some shapes you can use a flat brush like this one, which allows you to make more like geometrical shapes, just sharper edges and not those round organic shapes. So sometimes this is great. For example, for architectural pieces you can use these brushes, but I feel sometimes also for hair they're a great way to just make different kinds of shapes. I try to implement this brush, but I like to use it a little bit more often. But I think for those wavy hair, squirrel brushes are probably a little bit easier to work with. But for some shapes you can use the flat brush too. Now I want to move on painting the crown. And the crown, like every other shiny metal thing that you can paint with watercolors, there is a special technique that I use, which is rather easy and simple in my opinion. It's easier than painting flowers or hair or skin, because watercolor automatically does what you want when you want to paint jewelry. First of all, you can use a metal paint to do that. So for the crown I decided to use gold. And the cool thing is, when you have a lot of details, you can just leave those spots open. So the details with jewelry, the effect that they create is making lots of highlights, so you have a lot of white spots in your reference photo. That is the easiest way in the world to render with watercolors. As you can see, I just leave tons of little white spots there and I just paint around them. I don't even pay attention to my reference. I just leave those white spots and just paint around them. Doesn't matter if they look exactly like on the reference photo, but if you leave those white highlights, they create the super sharp edges, and the white will brightly distinguish from the watercolor, and it will already look like metal without you doing a lot. This is just the first layer, and on the next layers we'll just add more of these cell shading layers, and then you will see how realistic it will look in the end. So painting like jewelry with watercolors is basically very, very easy. And here again I also use different colors while just working on the sweat area. I started with the golden on the top of the crown because there it's a little bit lighter, and then at the edges it gets darker, so I just switch to a darker brown. I can just mix brown into the gold. And I used the same technique with the ornaments of the crown, just using a very small tiny brush to add those details, leave some highlights open, and use a variation of gold and brown to just make this beautiful transition effect between the colors, which only works with watercolors. For the inside of the ornaments, I mix an ultramarine blue as a base color. So this crown has this almost like church-like windows in the middle of the ornaments, and I will just depict them a little bit simplified as I will depict the whole crown. So I will not firstly paint it as dark as I see it on the reference. I will only pick some elements that I find most beautiful, for example the individual gemstones that you can find on the on it, and of course the church window ornaments and some of the black gemstones or pearls around it. But on the reference photo the crown is very dark and I want it to be very bright and golden. And also, when you blade on areas with watercolor, sometimes they look the best in the first layer. So the more layers you use, you will lose this lightness. So I think the golden layer that I did first already looks good, and I want to work on it more than I have to. Like with all the elements of this composition, I don't want to overwork them. the crown is still wet and I can't work on more details or just add more water to it without it bleeding into each other, I decided to move on to the next element of the composition, and I decided to paint in some of the dark hair. Here again, I want to make beautiful shapes first, so I concentrate on every brush stroke being interesting and flowy and make really nice, almost calligraphy shapes. And for that you can use the tip of the brush or the side of it, and with trying to hold the brush and make forms with it, like those dynamic shapes, those dynamic movements, you in the best case get interesting shapes that just give the watercolor its freshness. Like we did in the previous steps, here again I'm also adding like different variations of colors to the hair, not only brown, but I also use blue and red. And you can also switch to a smaller brush for tiny hair strands at the edges, and for more water, for more watery effect, and so on. So for each brush stroke you can vary the like little settings that you have with watercolors: color, water, type of brush, and like how you hold the brush. For example, I have here, for example, I take the flat brush again to make the different shapes that I did in the beginning, to get the best out of this watercolor that I can. It doesn't always have to be a perfect copy of the reference. This is not the point of art. Obviously, you want to make an artwork, a unique piece that is visually interesting and just fascinating. And I think watercolor offers so much ways to do that, because you never know how some shapes emerge and you have not so much control. So in the end, people ask, like, how did that happen? How did this shape and this beautiful layering happen? And you can't say it yourself because so much of it is random and accident, and this makes this medium so fascinating to me. Anyway, so I just continued this hair, and yeah, let's move on to the next part. let's continue with the face. As I said in the beginning, we will just jump from element to element in this composition. When you have an elaborate composition, that makes sense. If you just only have one thing, maybe a face or maybe a butterfly, you can work on this. But for a whole painting, you have to keep the overall thing in mind. Here I continue working, or I start working on the lips. I mix a darker red tone and use a very tiny detail brush to fill in the exact shape of the lips. If you get the shape wrong, it's rather difficult to correct that. So this is an area where you have to be focused and concentrated a little bit more. And yeah, I like to start with inside the outlines that I did, and then I carefully like maybe enhance the shape, make it a little bit bigger, so that hopefully I render it like I see it on the reference photo. And while the lip still dries, I work on the other parts of the face. Here, this is just the lash line, and here again, the shape is important. They should be even, like the eyes should be obviously even. And don't rush. You have all the time in the world. Just make sure you concentrate on the proportions, and yeah, try to not make shapes that will turn your portrait into a mutant, because this can happen, like if one eye is too big or the eyebrow is too strong. So just start with light colors. Here on this portrait that I took myself, like the face I took, the photo of the face I took myself, and the hand too. The rest of the painting, all the fantasy clothing and the hair, is from another photo. So I skillfully mixed the two together in Photoshop, but on the face, when I photographed it, I made sure that I have this shadow that casts from the top of the head and have like shadows directly under the nose and the eyes, because this is the easiest way to paint it in watercolor. And not only that, it also looks, in my opinion, the best if you have this type of shadow. So here I just carefully fill in these shadows around the eyes, and again I try to implement lots of colors, blues, yellows and greens, all wet and red, so that they have a chance to bleed into each other. And whenever I feel that the shadow is odd or looks strange, because everything is wet, I can just still correct the shape and make it larger. For the rest of the face, I applied the same technique, and I work carefully on the cheekbones, because here it is important to not mix a color too dark. So I always try to have a variation of brown, green and blue tones, and I carefully work around the shadows of the topography of the face. So you have lighter areas there, you have dark areas there, and I don't pay attention to soft blending. So I just still applying the cell shading method and only add shadows where they belong. And when I decide to add a shadow, I am like secure with it and make a bold brush stroke so that I know there will be an edge. That's okay, because the shape of the shadow looks good. Here it was a little bit too dark, so I could just add water to it and make this part of the shadow lighter. But you see how interesting and nice the face looks if you have those strong and bold shadows. And then you can, if you know, okay, the shape is right, you can manipulate them and add layers of other colors on top of them. For example, here on the eye we have this orange and this yellow, and it just gives the make it so interesting, because you have this one shape, but having also the transitions between the colors in this wet shape, it's it looks very surreal but still realistic. So I think that's very, very beautiful and a very neat trick or technique that you can use in your watercolors. let's move on with the crown. So one part of the crown is these very small black pearls. And whenever you paint jewelry, you have to be patient, because beautiful jewelry mostly consists of lots of little elements that are like lots of the same elements, basically, like one element after another, and it is the same. Here we have those black pearls. Each one of these pearls has a tiny highlight, so I try to leave a gap for the tiny highlight. And it is important to use a small brush and don't rush it. Be careful and fill in all of these little shapes. In the end, it's totally worth it. Takes a lot of time, but when you rush it, it will just not look good. So just take your time and fill out repetitive elements, although it might be boring. You can add just more colors to them. I started with the black, but you can also use a little bit red. Just vary them. It will make your watercolor look more interesting. Okay, pearls are finished. Let's continue with the painting in the hair again. Because the pearls are still wet, I cannot continue on the rest of the crown, so I just pick an area that I have to still work on. Here we can use also the flat brush again, because we need some long and sharp edges around the face. Be careful, of course, to not paint over the white of the face. I think I didn't perfectly follow this line. I went a little bit over it, but I can correct it later on with color pencils. But definitely try to stay in line so that you don't paint over areas and then you will regret it. Here again, switch up the colors. I use red, I use blues. For darker colors with watercolors, the combination of indigo, blue and some sort of red or purple always looks nice, so I try that. You can also use, of course, the combination of green and blue or red and green, that like all the complementary colors will always look very beautiful. there where the hair meets the crown, of course, I switched to a smaller detail brush to be able to paint this teeny tiny details there. The border of the crown is not straight, so we have a little bit of ornamentation going on there, so I have to be careful and try to get the border right. And while the hair is still wet, you can add in more darker colors and just bleed them out and just make nicer effects. You see the hair, like the whole area of the hair, has now lots of different colors because we applied different techniques there in order to get this like very abstract effect in the end. Now I have this dark color on my brush, I can just continue adding in the lashes and the lash line and the makeup. Now we can finally work on the details of the crown. Well, I'm not sure if you were looking forward to it, but I personally really like to work on these details because it is very satisfying. With a couple of brush strokes, you are already able to have a huge impact. So what we are doing is we have a look at the reference photo and determine where we can find all the gemstones. And painting in the gemstones is very easy. Basically, you have a base color, then you have one or more highlights that you will leave as a gap, and you just paint around them. In addition, as an extra, you can also, once the gemstone area is wet, just dip in it with another color like we did it all before in this painting already, and then you have like a couple of colors in your gemstone. You have a beautiful transition and it already looks good, like the pink gemstone that I'm working that I just painted there. This is the most easiest technique, I feel. It's so easy. And also, like for this little pearls, you just make a tiny circle and then leave a gap in the middle, then you already have a gemstone. It's like super satisfying. Yeah, so you just have a look at the reference photo and fill in all the gemstones first, and later on we will just continue with the more details on it. And here, for example, I add another layer on a gemstone, just give it more depth. You can do that, just one layer and then another one. Add a shadow, for example, or leave a mid-tone highlight. You can do that too. Many gemstones have a little shadow on itself, so adding a small shadow or a little contour can help adding more depth too. So just continue this process. It is it takes patience, but I think it's a lot of fun too. And the cool thing with jewelry is that if you use gold or just metallic color, it already looks so good and so convincing. So I hope you have fun with this. Okay, so here we have a little bit of a difficult pattern. We have these church window elements in this crown. Well, you don't have to do that if it's like too exhausting for you. I like to really render each detail of the crown. With the strokes there, I did a little mistake because they have to meet all in the center, and it was a little bit difficult for me to get that right. Yeah, so basically just try to make like a clock where you have the different times, and they just all have to meet in the middle. It's a little bit difficult. I'm not so good at geometrical shapes, but in the end I just used blue gouache and just to correct some of the weird stripes that I was like trying to paint there. And now we are just continuing filling in all the white areas of the crown, because that gives the crown depth and make it look super realistic in the end, or illustrative, however you want to call the style. And I just basically compare my painting with the reference photo, fill in the remaining gaps, and also determine where the shadows are, because filling in the gemstones is pretty easy, but then also you have shadows in the crowns. You have areas that are a little bit darker. For example, the church window ornaments and everything around it is a tad darker than the part of the crown, like the golden part of the crown that I painted first. And all the elements behind this golden part also have to be distinguished, so I have to paint a border around it. And yeah, so we just have to fill in all these tiny details. And whenever there is a white gap, we need to check, okay, need that be darker? Is there a shadow? Also, in the end, it helps to understand the form of the crown and just understand the elements, and then you can target some of the elements and add a contour around them so that they stand out a little bit. That helps too. So we just build up carefully all the values so that it looks convincing in the end. And again, you can use a contour to just make as a little trick to help making this convincing depiction. having added a shadow under the golden part of the crown, I just continue adding a little bit more details to the face, like the nostrils and some shadows in the eyes. Just because I have the paint on my hand, and as I said in the beginning, I want to work on each element relatively simultaneously, so everything fits together. And then if I have parts of the painting half finished, they can stay half finished in case they fit to other elements. So this is a great way to not only make a coherent painting, but also save time, so I don't have to work out like each flower perfectly if they already fit to the painting. So here I'm just adding more details to the shadows under the eyebrow, just a little bit more orange, and just adding more depth before I move on to the flowers. Now, can you see how well all the elements of the composition fit together already? Nothing stands out especially strong from the other elements, and everything looks very fresh and light. The only thing that maybe is worked or like detailed the most is the crown, and I think it already looks good, so I don't want to work on it like more to make it heavy and strong. But for example, the hair looks very good already. I like the freshness, and some of the flower, like the areas of the flowers looks also good. So I don't want to overwork anything. So what we're going to do now is adding more depth to the flowers, and we are doing this just by repeating the same technique which we have started painting the flowers. So basically the cell shading technique. We are comparing the reference photo and have a look at each flower petal and add shadows where we can find them. We will also add more colors to each of these red areas. As you see, I just added a tiny area there, and then I just continue on to the next one, to the next dark area, and carefully add those tiny shadows. Each of the petal has a shadow, casts a shadow on another petal, and we are pretty much trying to render that. Of course, we need to simplify each of these shadows because we can zoom in more and more and it gets even more detailed. So I try to simplify the shadow. Of course, it takes practice, so if that doesn't work for you in the beginning, like, it's no problem. This is just a process that takes practice, and the more flowers you take, the better they will look. The flowers you paint, the better they will look. So don't stress if it doesn't look as good in your case, like with your painting in the beginning. So also, it's a lot of concentrating, so don't try to rush that, because then you won't get a nice result then. Here, for example, you see the tiny sharp line that I do because I found like that the one petal is standing out from the other one, and it requires this sharp edge there so that it can be distinguished. And then I just check each other petal that I can distinguish, and the better your drawing is, or your traced drawing, the easier it will get for you to distinguish the petals. If you're going for a rather loose effect, then you don't need that. There are different ways to paint flowers. You can also paint them with gouache, and don't pay attention to all this tiny nonsense and detail work here. So this is just one technique to paint flowers. I decided to use this one because I felt it would fit in well with the rest of the painting, to have everything painted in the same with the same technique, but you don't have to do that. Here I'm just continuing this technique and adding those sharp edges and the sharp shadows, and pay attention. The most important thing is to not get too dark, I think. If you get too dark, you will ruin your flower because then the contrast is too high, and everything that is like the most important thing about painting flowers is the softness, and you only have those shadows. You don't have them everywhere, so not every shadow is dark. Most of the shadows are very, very soft. So just use a dark color only if you are sure that it is there.